All right, so again, welcome everyone for those that just joined to the Noveline Innovation Speaker Series. I will hand it over to Eric Eiselbacher, the director of the lab, to introduce the speaker series.
Great, thanks, Jen. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Eric Eiselbacher. I'm the director of the Healthcare Transformation Lab. And on behalf of the entire HTL team, I'd like to welcome all of you to the Noveline Speaker Series. This is a quarterly series of talks to which we invite speakers from a variety of backgrounds, from both academia and industry, to share with members of the Mass General community their lessons and insights about the process of healthcare innovation and transformation. So we're especially pleased today to welcome today's speaker, Jennifer Goldsack, and to introduce Jen, I'd like to turn the screen over to my colleague, Dr. Jared Conley, who is both an attending in the MGH Emergency Department and, more importantly, the Associate Director of the Healthcare Transformation Lab. So Jared, I'll turn it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Eric. It's great to be with you all today. Again, we're really excited to be hosting Jennifer Goldsack from DIME, and really looking forward to the dialogue we'll have together. As we all know, as we move a healthcare system to be digitally transformed, I think collaborators like DIME will be instrumental in helping that. And I think you'll see some of those opportunities that have already been accomplished through Jen and her team's work. Quick intro on Jennifer. She's again the executive director of the Digital Medicine Society. She previously served several years at the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, or CTTI, which was a public and private partnership co-founded by Duke University and the FDA. She spent time before that at the University of Pennsylvania, and has more recently also launched the Value Institute, which was a pragmatic research and innovation center embedded in a large academic medical center in Delaware. She earned her master's degree in chemistry from the University of Oxford. For those of you who don't know her, she has a lovely accent from Britain, and you'll hear that soon. I used to live there, and so I find it quite appealing as well. And then she has a MBA from George Washington University. She's also of note, something I learned having interfaced with her recently, a former significant athlete, and I competed at the international level in rowing, and excited to hear from Jennifer. So we'll turn the time over to you.
Thanks, Jared. My mum would be very proud of that, so I'll let her know, and thank you. Delighted to be here today. I was also pleased to hear, Jared, you report me as having an English accent. I've been here for the best part of 15 years at this point, and I'm increasingly accused of being Australian, so this is a good day for me all around. Can someone just give me a thumbs up and let me know if you can see my slides? Super. All right, well, we've done enough of my introductions. Let me go back and do a quick refresher on who we are at DIME. And actually, before I do that, Jen, you set me up perfectly here. When we were talking about how to use this session, you had the lovely idea that we would sort of title this Navigating the Future of Digital Health, Collaborating to Promote Evidence-Based Use. And that's exactly what we do at DIME as a sort of non-profit convener. So perhaps before I dive in, and I've resisted the urge to spend the entire time sort of sharing resources with everyone on the line, but let me try and describe just for a second why this fits so nicely with who we are and what we do at the Digital Medicine Society. So first and foremost, we are a global nonprofit. Our mission is to advance the ethical, effective, equitable, and safe use of digital technologies to redefine healthcare and improve lives. I think the last piece is really important to redefine healthcare and improve lives. I think it's critically important to note that we are not tech determinists here at DIME. Our goal here, our definition of success, is not that we have shoehorned digital solutions into every single nook and cranny in our healthcare system, but rather we've thought about this exciting new set of tools in the toolbox, and we've thought about how they can be intentionally and thoughtfully developed and deployed to address some of the most pressing challenges that our industry has faced for decades, and in some cases, new challenges, even greater pain points than we've ever faced before. That's our definition of success here at DIME. And while we're still quite a young organization, we were launched only in May of 2019, I'm very proud of the outsized impact we've had as we digitize the healthcare environment. And I think that in large part comes down to how we are positioned. So what we aren't is, a tech company in Silicon Valley who occasionally reaches out into the clinical environment, maybe has the good sense to occasionally ask someone in the clinical world whether it would work, a solution would work in a clinical workflow, or maybe even how you pay for healthcare, and goodness, maybe even talk to a patient now and again. Nor are we a sort of clinical entity that thinks occasionally about a tech consult. We really do think about the digitization of healthcare as being a team sport and a truly interdisciplinary endeavor. And I think a lot of our success has been derived from that. How this plays into our activities more broadly is to think about building this community. So again, the sort of digitization of healthcare is probably the most interdisciplinary activity I can certainly imagine. We can think of citizen scientists and cybersecurity experts. We can think about the physicists and the engineers we need. We can think about the product folks, the data scientists, the clinical scientists, the innovators, the clinical care providers, the healthcare executives, the payers, the regulators, the investors, the funders. We need everyone to be at the table, speaking the same language and driving towards the same North Star for this to be successful, for this actually to improve lives and not simply add more layers of inefficiency and make health equity even worse. So what do we do at Dime once we have this community together? Then we think about solving some of the most pressing and persistent challenges impeding the ongoing digitization of healthcare. Where is there uncertainty about what good looks like? Where are the appropriate evidentiary standards unclear? Where are incentives malaligned? Where do we need to do sort of new evidence generation to essentially ensure that as we digitize the healthcare environment, and it's not a case of if, but when, that we are doing it in a way that serves every single individual that our industry exists to care for, and we do it equally well for everyone, and we make sure it's equally accessible to everyone, and we are creating a provider experience that is acceptable. And then the third piece of our work is, we can have all the right people at the table. We can, stand on our soapbox and say, hey, here's what good looks like. But we also need to make sure that in this increasingly changing environment, that the field actually has the necessary skills to be able to implement these best practices. There is a sort of rampant need, in fact, across every industry, to make sure that there's a greater understanding of the new technologies that we're being asked to use. Similarly, a lot of our tech colleagues need to quickly and more deeply understand the clinical environment. So we spend a lot of time disseminating information and doing education as well. All right. So we've covered Dime. Let's actually get into some specific case examples. Let's start to relate this back to your day-to-day. The best place to start is, what on earth do we mean by digital health? And, we did this work a few years ago with colleagues at the Digital Therapeutics Alliance, Health Excel, Node Health, to really say, how can we actually categorize this fledgling industry? And at the time, we sort of, we stand by this now, we can cast the net broadly and say, as we use any kind of digital tool in the delivery of healthcare and even in wellness, that's digital health. Within that segment of digital medicine products, which are the evidence-based tools that are intended to improve the way we care for people. And then within that, there's a subset of products that we would describe as digital therapeutics that actually, through nothing more than a software product and without any sort of human intervention, can serve as either a diagnostic or a treatment. Digital therapeutics is a word that was much loved by the venture community, I think vastly overused, but I think it serves as well to clearly delineate between the broad digitization of healthcare, which is powered by all of the digital health products, digital medicine, which are those, evidence-based tools that measure and intervene, and then that very particular and small subset of digital therapeutics where the software itself is the intervention or the intervention or the diagnostic. We spelt this out. We talked about the different kinds of clinical evidence and regulatory oversight across these different classes. And then we thought about what are some of the examples, right? We can think about sort of, telehealth platforms, transmission platforms, data capture and storage, we can think about measurement and intervention products, and then we can think about those digital therapeutics. Defining this in the early days of the digitization of healthcare has been very useful, but we've evolved a lot since then. And here's a piece that I had the privilege of writing with colleagues of mine here at Dime and also colleagues from the VA, where we thought, we can talk about products all day, but what are we actually doing here? When we think about not just a digital health product, but we think about the digitization of healthcare, what do we mean? And so, when I talk about this, I think there's a couple of opportunities, a little bit jargony, but I think there's the opportunity to really reimagine the entire value chain of healthcare delivery. In less jargony language, I think about a future state where we really reimagine healthcare as something that's built around the patient and not the clinic. And that's certainly not to say that the clinic is going to go away, nor should it. And it's certainly not saying that clinical care professionals are going to go away. They mustn't. We need them. And in fact, we need to do everything we can to retain them. But I think what we need to think about is, can we create a healthcare system that instead of sitting in the clinic, waiting for an individual to present on our doorstep, sick, perhaps very sick, and by that point facing a bad outcome and very expensive, and then define good healthcare as how good are we at treating them and intervening at that stage? And can we reimagine a future of healthcare where we can capture data outside of the clinic, where we can have these flows of data and information, where we can address the maldistribution of clinical experts and the patients who need their care through digital technologies, and think about, actually, could our healthcare system be evaluated by how good are we at keeping people healthy, as opposed to how good are we at intervening once they're sick? The reality is that unfortunately people will always get sick, especially with an aging population, but there is a fundamentally different value proposition in the digital era of healthcare. And that's what we're pursuing, not individual solutions, individual apps, individual algorithms. I think that's a fallacy. And this point solution approach doesn't serve us as we think about taking the digitization of healthcare to scale, which frankly, in my opinion, and I hope we get the chance to talk about this during the discussion, is an imperative right now when we look at some of the crises that our industry is facing in the way that we retain expert and sort of, passionate clinical professionals, and in the way that we care for people. So if that's our North Star, let's dig in a little bit more to this idea of, how can collaborative work actually help us achieve this? So I'm going to reference another resource that we developed with our VA colleagues, and we actually put together a playbook, a very action-oriented, open access actually. So I'll make sure you guys get the slides after this, and there's links to all of these resources. How can we actually think about what good looks like in this era for starting to use some of these tools and solutions to reimagine healthcare? As we put this together, there were a couple of different sections. We thought about the opportunities, we thought about some of the definitions, and most importantly, sort of regulatory environment we find ourselves in. And then we really focused on sort of 8 technologies that we're not excited about because of the technology themselves, but we believe that they are mature solutions that can intentionally be used together, right, as part of a reimagination of healthcare in a different ecosystem to really redefine how we care for people, make it more accessible, make it more equitable, make it more affordable for the individual and for society. And I think what was interesting to us was, okay, so on the one hand, we don't want to think about these point solutions, but on the other hand, why do we actually care about these digital products, and why do we think they're solutions, and solutions to what? And I think this was a really interesting and valuable, in our opinion, exercise to go through. Here are, I think it's 8 digital technologies that we believe are mature enough for prime time. And in fact, it's not even our belief. There are enough case examples of these things out in the world actually doing good work for patients. And we can think about their functional application across the entire, lived experience of the patient, that patient journey, but also across the entire healthcare continuum. And it's when we think about these different points of value and think about how we can successfully develop and deploy solutions in these environments, that's how we start to get back to a moment where we can actually talk about reimagining the entire healthcare value chain. But I don't think I've said it enough, so I'm going to bore you again. We can't keep thinking about these individual point solutions. So here's another example of some work that we've been doing with a tremendous collaboration that's really intended to move beyond individual point solutions. So we have a body of work that's focused on virtual first care. What do I mean by virtual first care? There's a lovely definition, but when, at the heart of the matter, it's really thinking about care that can be delivered virtually until it can't. And what do we mean by that? Until the point where someone has to come in for a procedure where it's not, or perhaps it's not safe for them to receive care virtually any longer, or perhaps it's not their preference to receive care virtually any longer, but it's not virtual only care. I think it's a silly myth that was perpetuated by a small but vocal number that healthcare is going to exist solely in the ether going forward. But how do we think about all of these different components? And I won't read them out, you can sort of look at them on the screen, but all of these different jigsaw pieces, these components, how do they come together to allow us to build care around the patient and not the clinic? We don't care about the individual jigsaw piece. We are thinking about a whole person sort of care experience that does include things like navigation, that we aren't offering opinions and action items to the patients that we exist to serve, but rather we are giving them solutions and moving them along their healthcare journey to a point of better health. I'm going to take the opportunity to sort of celebrate the fantastic partners that we have in this particular collaborative. I think this is why we've been so successful in creating resources such as a guide to payer virtual first care contracting. So here we actually have a draft template that when our colleagues have used it, whether it's our colleagues on the payer side of the house or our virtual first care providers, it gets those virtual first care providers out of what has previously been an almost infinite loop where they get bounced back and forth. They're, you're a software as a service. No, we're not. We're a healthcare provider. You're a digital therapeutic. No, we're not. We're a healthcare provider. We just happen to deliver care virtually. And so I think we've had some really good luck and reduced up to 18 months in some cases of the sort of contract negotiation to coverage and reimbursement between virtual first care providers and payers using this contracting toolkit that also has some definitions around coding. So this is something that I think could be incredibly valuable to folks on the line. Again, it's all open access and I've put the links on here. One of the other things that's critically important is sort of care transitions. I defer to my clinical colleagues on the line, but I would offer up that even before virtual care transitions were one of the greatest challenges in providing whole person, complete and effective care. Also a real inhibitor to efficiency in the healthcare sector. And now when we start to introduce these virtual first care providers and all of these different sorts of solutions, how do we make sure that there's not this small island of innovation happening here and there's some nibbling around the edges in the traditional healthcare systems because we've just translated the typical chokehold doctor-patient, visit to a platform just like this, but rather how can we think about the integration of virtual first approaches with the critically important role that traditional healthcare systems provide? How can we think about the patient journey into, out of and across virtual first care so that it is a really fully integrated part of the digitized healthcare environment? So we've done an awful lot of work on this. This work is not done. This work is ongoing, but this is something that I think could be incredibly helpful to folks on the line. And happy to talk more about this when we move to Q&A. I think the other piece that's interesting is we did some benchmarking at the end of last year just to see where the industry is, right? Is this just stuff people are talking about? What are sort of payers and employers and benefits consultants in particular, as unfortunately in too many cases, the gatekeeper to these kinds of novel approaches to care, what's their opinion? So we partnered with Omada and also had some insights from Rock Health and did a large national survey of nearly 800 sort of senior leaders from across the payer community, essentially. And it was really interesting to see, and again, this report is also open access. It was really interesting to see that there's quite clearly a group of what we would call sort of innovators, even within the payer environment, who recognize not the gimmicky value of, we're going to go digital, but actually the true value that can be returned to large employers, payers, and most importantly, patients themselves when we do appropriately use these virtual first care solutions. So I would guide you to that. And just to read you in on some of the work that we're doing ongoing with that impact community, there's a partnership with the AMA, and we are particularly looking at coding and payment in the digital era of health. And we will actually revisit that again during the course of this presentation. We're doing some work around what we're describing as a virtual first checklist, and that will be released next month, so April, to almost think about how can we, I'm going to use a terrible phrase, but how can we sort the trash between those virtual first care providers that are exceptional and provide, you know, care that's just as good, dare I say, if not better than a traditional sort of clinic visit, and where perhaps do we have concerns about trust, and how can we benchmark maturity? The third one is specifically around value and evidence, and that will be coming later this year when we want to make a claim that, this virtual first approach for this particular, I don't know, GI issue is better than perhaps what you can get in your local clinic. That's a bold claim. What do we mean by better? And so there's some work ongoing there, and welcome your insights, and would love to chat about that during comments when we can. But this is this idea of a hybrid future of care. And one of the tools in the toolbox that, I think is perhaps some of the most mature is around different connected sensor technologies. So, what we might describe as remote patient monitoring, for example. And before I keep going about the maturity and the value of this kind of work, or the remote patient monitoring and healthcare delivery, I want to take a little bit of a sidebar actually and survey the progress of digital endpoints in drug development or in medical product development, because I think this gives us an idea of what's possible. So back in October 2019, we actually set up here at the Digital Medicine Society, and again, this is open access, everything we do is open access, a crowdsourced library of digital endpoints. And so what this library represents is a complete and comprehensive catalog of every digital endpoint that's being used to answer questions about
a digital library,
well, thank you, Siri. They a sort of repository of every endpoint, digital endpoint that's being used to answer questions about the safety and efficacy of new medical products. And in October 2019, we were incredibly excited to find that, this wasn't the stuff of the future, this was here now, that there were in fact 12 sponsors who were already leveraging digital endpoints to answer questions about their investigational new medical products, that there were 34 digital endpoints being used, nearly half of those positioned as primary. And for those drugs and biologics, nearly 50% of them were being used in phase 2 and phase 3 studies. And when I say we were excited, we really were. We wrote a sort of Stat News article about this and, did all sorts of work. But fast forward to today. So what, 2 years and change later, we now have 104 sponsors who are collectively using 378 unique endpoints across their medical product trials, that we have over 2/3 of them are deployed in phase 2 or phase 3, and that we have nearly 1/3 that are positioned as primary, but you actually see almost all of them are taking Delta from the study. This is enormous progress, and you can see the breadth of industry adoption here, which is absolutely, some of these didn't load, I apologize, absolutely extraordinary in such a short period of time. A lot of this has been driven, this industry adoption has been driven by a rapidly advancing and maturing regulatory environment. So in December 2021, we saw a draft guidance come out from our colleagues at FDA, the use of digital health technologies for remote data acquisition and clinical investigations. They had some really thoughtful work in here. They made it very clear that to use a digital health technology in a clinical trial, it didn't necessarily have to be a medical device. It also was very supportive of bring your own device approaches, both of which I think are very innovative. On the other side of the pond, we've seen our colleagues at the European Medicines Agencies getting even further ahead of this. They qualified the first digital endpoint back in April 2019, and then came up with a very good Q&A document in June of 2020. Coupled with all of this, and I'm going to get back to the healthcare delivery environment shortly, but coupled with all of this is, and this is a tremendous report from the World Economic Forum, and I highly recommend this for your reading. They did a global survey around consumer in the digital era. And there were three key takeaways that I think translate directly to how we think about the digitization of healthcare. So first of all, then the consumer mindset, and I'm sure this resonates with all of you on the call, we think less about a product and we think more about, or a service, we think more about an experience, right? What does it mean to have a subscription to something and we can access it anytime that we want? That we are expecting a sort of white glove approach to what we need when we need it. And it's not these discrete product choices that we are forced to make ourselves at a point in time. We've also become accustomed to hyper-personalization. So whether that's Netflix what to watch, whether that's Amazon telling us what to buy, or all of the other many ways that we should be terrified about that, advertisers are using our data to personalize what they deliver to us. That's what we can and should be doing in healthcare. We can think about the fact that a digital tool can be modular, that we can personalize, digital solutions to be culturally appropriate, to meet the needs of the patient exactly where they are when they need it. Clinics are open from 9 till 5, but mental health care is, needs a 24/7. How can we deliver to individuals what they need when they need it? How can we do hyper-personalization in the digital era of health? And then I think the last thing is really interesting, particularly vis-a-vis data, right? We can think about ownership to access as being the difference between, owning a car and relying on Lyft, for example, or the difference between having a vacation home, must be nice, or relying on Airbnb all the time and giving yourself options and not having to carry that burden. That's what, we often think of when we think about moving from an ownership to access model, but it applies to data in the digital era. I mean, I remember writing, as I'm sure many of you on the line do, 10 years ago, not that long ago, IRB applications, and, you talk about your data privacy and you'd say, well, the data will be kept in a locked filing cabinet and only the PI will have the key and the statistician will work on the data on an unnetworked computer. I mean, it couldn't be more different to where we find ourselves today. And the greatest benefit, in my opinion, of the digitization of healthcare is the fact that data isn't locked in the manila folder in a filing cabinet anymore, and it actually can flow into, out of, and across different settings and environments and between different experts who can help care for people, that we can drive a learning healthcare system in a way that we've only been able to talk about for the last decade or so, obviously all with the necessary permissions, with full disclosure and informed consent from those individuals whose data that we're using. So that's the backdrop, right? I started this sort of segment with, let's talk remote patient monitoring. And we talked about the success in medical product development and the broad adoption, the regulatory improvements. We've talked about the consumer backdrop. And there's a very compelling slide that some of you may have seen. And it talks about, the use of the RPM CPT codes in healthcare delivery. And this is a tremendous graph. If you look at it, it's nearly 2,000% growth in remote patient monitoring, so on and so forth. But, the reality is that this tells you how you can manipulate data. This is really barely any use of remote patient monitoring at all, goes through exponential growth and gets to a very small amount of remote patient monitoring use. The reality is that we aren't really using these tools extensively to power the way we care for people. We aren't actively capturing information and relying upon it within our current clinical workflows. Adoption is remarkably low, despite how sensational this graph might look. And I think it's particularly interesting to reflect on this. We all know the pain that healthcare systems are feeling across the board right now. The fact that there are opportunities to bill that barely anyone is taking advantage of tells you a few things. Probably the immaturity of our field. And I say this as a real enthusiast and someone who believes that we can really reimagine how we care for people in the digital era, but we still have an awful lot of work to do to create the necessary incentives to reimagine care in such a way that remote patient monitoring actually becomes valuable, whether that's clinical workflows and how we care for chronic disease patients, or whether it's powering hospital at home, where we're seeing really, really great examples, but they're sort of onesies and twosies, right? People are really trying to figure out how to do this well, what the risk profiles are. We aren't seeing any of this at scale yet. And I think that's really important to realize. As we think about our work on coding and payment as well, we've also got to question that, if we are going to use the use of remote patient monitoring to really reimagine how we care for people and try and keep them out of the clinic, then we might need to change the reimbursement rate for some of these activities, because there may not be a visit to bill for as a result of using these tools. In fact, there shouldn't be if we're doing this well, and we need to contemplate that as we price this out for a future and different way of delivering healthcare. Okay, so I did say I wasn't going to talk the whole time and we'd have good time for discussion, but it's hard to get through a conversation like this and not consider the buzzwords du jour of sort of artificial intelligence and machine learning methodologies. I always love to use this example. It's not sexy at all. It is all about reducing administrative burden. And I think that if we do nothing else, although I hope we do many more things, but if we do nothing else with AI and ML, then try and alleviate the crushing burden on our clinical care providers of administrative tasks, then we've done something right with the digitization of healthcare. We can think about the clinician staffing crisis that we are facing. We can think about the levels of burnout among our clinician colleagues, and we can also reflect on the 40 to 50% of time that's spent doing absolutely awful work that not a single person who sort of worked their tail off through medical school envisaged doing in their future. They had a vocation, they wanted to care for people, and now they do data entry. All of this can be sort of absolved, and I think this is one of the most exciting approaches. There's also all sorts of ways we can think about developing clinical decision support tools to try and, extend the decision-making we get in academic centers and, centers of excellence, so that the best clinical decisions are available to every single patient. We can think about, screening, diagnostics, all of these sorts of things that are powered by AI, but, the use cases are broad. And so too are the mistakes that we've made so far. So we need to really think differently about what the benefits are in the digital era of healthcare, but we also have to be eyes wide open to the new risks. I think there's a very near-term future that, with intent and with the kind of collaboration that I've been giving you some examples of today, we can move to a point where we are in a position to capture almost all of the benefits that AI offers the healthcare system and the patients we're all here to serve, and where, with eyes wide open and with intent, we can actually minimize many of the risks. But the examples of risks and bias are pretty appalling. We can think about all of the tools that perform differently across different bodies. And I'm not sure how many of you may have seen this Stat News sort of expose. I think it came out just over a week ago, that was thinking about the use of AI and how it's used in the Medicare Advantage population to sort of price out what acceptable care is. And the rather damning conclusion of all of this is, they're cutting off care for seniors in Medicare Advantage programs. And unfortunately, by the time it's resolved, those individuals have usually passed away. I mean, this is an absolutely unacceptable state of being, and we need to be working on this. We do a lot of this. I did mention our education activities as well as our research activities here at Dime. There are, I think perhaps the one course of our many courses that I wanted to flag today were our applied digital health ethics. If I were queen for a day, I would insist that anyone who wants to operate in the digital era of health must take this in order to move forward. I think it should be table stakes. And so, highly recommend this to you. And I'll wrap up now by sort of circling back on why I get so excited and why I'm so proud that our organization can collaborate with so many of the innovators and care providers, because, I do think about this future state where we aren't, as I said, here sitting in the clinic waiting for someone to turn up sick, and we can actually reach every single person, and we can have a healthcare system that's focused on keeping people well, as opposed to intervening when they're sick. So with that, yep, I think that's everything. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing, and Jared and Eric, turn it back to you and we'll have a discussion.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. That was a whirlwind of all the incredible work you've been doing since 2019. And so excited to see, as I heard you speak, it just made me think a lot about the incredible work that's been done to digitize healthcare. But that how, in many ways, it's kind of these pieces of scaffolding across a system that's so complex. And I think it's so refreshing to hear of an organization like yourself that's kind of helping to bring together parties and really establish a playing field that allows us to transition effectively, although, of course, you've got your work cut out for you. I wonder just quickly if we could just, we've got a few questions coming in. I might just kick it off by asking, we've got a bunch of clinicians and innovators from MGH in the broad Boston area on the line here. How might they best engage with your system or your organization, given that from what we've seen so far, most of the kind of parties at the table for you are bigger, larger organizations? How would an actual clinician that sees a pain point and an opportunity engage with an organization like Dime?
Perfect question. Thank you. So while we do typically at our sort of big project levels work with experts from within organizations, the way that we pick our project portfolio and the way that we develop our sort of education programming is by listening very carefully to our community. So we have, for example, if you go to the Dime website, you can join our Slack community, you can join our newsletter, and that gives you opportunity to feedback on those pain points. And so as individuals, there's a very low friction way to be part of an extraordinary community of innovators that's all open access. But we monitor those conversations, we engage in those conversations, and it's actually those conversations, and it's exactly the clinicians that you're sort of describing, Jared, coming to the table and saying, if I get pitched by one more vendor with an absence of evidence, or if I can't figure out how to XYZ, that's how we identify our next project and our next problem to solve for in the pre-competitive space. So I would be honored to welcome everyone on the line to that community. And I think that there would be a good amount of value that would be returned there too.
Great. Glad to hear that. Eric?
Jen, you mentioned an important topic, which is the behavior of and incentives of payers that sometimes run counter to digital health and the health of our patients. We were also pleased that one of the benefits of COVID was that telehealth really became well accepted by both patients and clinicians. And what a great opportunity to really quickly advance a field like that, only to see payers now scaling back on their reimbursements because they're worried that we'll overuse it rather than use it as a way to keep patients at home and reach patients who would have to travel long distance to clinics and hospitals. And it's just so discouraging to see that behavior. What do you see as the keys to changing that either governmental or private insurance behavior, where they try to resist anything that they see as potentially costing them money, even though it's actually advancing the field and expanding our ability to care for patients?
It's a really good question, and I wish I had a silver bullet answer. My take, and I'm curious for what you and others on the line think as well, is we're going to have to prove it. I don't think there is a shortcut here. Unfortunately, we're pretty entrenched. It's disappointing, quite frankly, to see some of the assumptions that are made by payers that we're just going to pull on a fee for service lever and overcharge and overuse wherever possible. I think it's also almost sort of funny in a ironic sense that they think this is even possible. You have to go and walk around a hospital right now and ask who's going to be doing the extra billing. There just aren't enough clinicians. It's the craziest thing I've ever heard. It's simply not possible. But I think what we actually have to do is, drive some really important spears and case examples where we can actually show that this sort of reimagined way of caring for people is actually, and I'm going to perhaps be controversial, I don't think we should pursue saving money as a useful way to have this conversation. We've been trying to save money in healthcare for a very long time, and it turns out we can't. And I'm actually quite proud to live in a country that's willing to spend 20% of our GDP on healthcare. I just wish we saw some return from it. So, I think rather what it is we actually have to show that within the timelines that our payer colleagues demand, that there is value that can be returned. We've done some of this work. So we actually did some work with the team at Hopkins, and it's published in JAMA Open. And what we did was we use the pandemic as a bit of a natural experiment. And there's a list, and I'm embarrassed I can't remember the correct name of the list, but it's a series of conditions for which the ER is used in a way that is fully suboptimal. And Jared, I'm sure you could name many things for which the ER is used that it's suboptimal, but it's things like UTIs, it's things like sort of terrible headaches where, you know, something's allowed to progress to a point of feeling emergent because there was no other opportunity. So we took this list and we said, if we use that visit in a massive set of index data, and it was all commercially insured patients, but if we use that, but hundreds of thousands, if we use that kind of visit as an index visit, and we look across where that index visit was a telehealth visit and where that index visit was in person, we actually saw lower utilization of healthcare in the telehealth group, which we think is sort of fascinating, and we continue to bang the drum on that. In addition, from within our impact community, we're starting to see some really compelling examples of the fact that actually maybe there are some cost savings. So I'm going back on myself here. So I'll give you one very tangible example. We have a partner called Oshi Health, and they are a virtual first GI specialty care provider. And they worked with, and we've actually written about this and I can direct you to it. They worked with UHC for about 14 months to be able to get reimbursement for the specialty care that they provide to a subset of patients. And while, and I quote a UHC colleague, it is terribly expensive, they are seeing incredible outcomes, and sort of they are starting to see downstream sort of lower utilization. There aren't sort of, we aren't immediately sending you for procedures, you know, the use of say a behavioral dietary coach, you know, to get you through all of this work can actually avoid you needing a lot of clinical intervention. And so overall there is cost saving. And I think we just have to doggedly pursue these kind of proof points, and we need to keep pushing. And I think the inflection point is going to come from the fact that we can't keep doing business as usual because there aren't enough doctors.
Right.
Love that. Let's turn to the audience. We've got a number of questions that have come in. First off, what do you see as the key to breaking through the broker barrier in a price-sensitive environment? What's the best, most compelling story to tell?
I mean, that's a really good question. I think that I think we have to do just what I was saying, right? Which is start to collect these stories, but stories over time. The problem is that snapshots in time, and we've seen this, Eric, you talked about sort of the pendulum swinging back the other way on how we're reimbursing for telehealth, that, you know, we are billing for things, you know, that perhaps we haven't before. Patients might actually have been getting the care that they always needed, but that looks like increased utilization. And no, that's not fraud, waste, and abuse. It might just be patients getting the care they always needed. So I think what we have to do, the most compelling story is a story that's going to be able to play out over time. And I don't think it needs to be sort of 10 years, but it might need to be 10 months in order for us to show what sort of total cost, perhaps not per member per month, but per member per year might look like, in order to make the case that we aren't jacking up spending. We might be redistributing spending, right? We might not be saving, but I think if we can make the case that there's then, you know, better retention on your plan, if we can then make the case that, you know, patient satisfaction is higher, so on and so forth, that's the kind of story I think we need to tell.
Great, love that. Another question, how do you foresee this work being taught in healthcare programs, medical school, PA programs? It says, I'm developing a course on digital health, but do think some of these concepts need to be taught across the board.
I couldn't agree with you more. So we have our sort of educational programming, and we actually, funnily enough, do have one CME offering, and it was developed with a medical school called Rocky Vista University. So they're a DO school, and they're actually the first that offers a 4-year track focused in digital. And so we actually had a lot of fun working with some of their like 3rd and 4th year students to help us put this course together. And, you know, that exists now as DME. You know, it's interesting. And I keep saying this and then not giving anyone any space to actually say anything. And I really would love to hear from you guys actually, but I think it's foolish to imagine that on top of everything else, that we would expect, a physician to also have the sort of command of data science in the same way that, a PhD computer scientist might, right? But what else do they have to do? They have to be able to evaluate a potential algorithm that they might want to roll out across their healthcare system and be able to ask the right questions about how it was tested to make sure that it's going to work for all of the patients and to be able to mitigate that risk. I think that when we think about training, it is useful to do it in the context of a more multidisciplinary healthcare environment. So it's less about what's all the knowledge that one person needs to hold and more about who are the folks that we need to have at the table, right? We can look at the absolute mess we've made of privacy over the last year or so due to large healthcare systems, and their marketing teams with good intent or their patient experience teams have said, we want to make it easier for patients to, make sure they're coming in for their follow-ups, getting their routine scans. So they're starting to use, the Metapixel tool to track people with the intent of improving the patient experience and outcomes. But with one compliance officer on staff, or like no one between the marketing team and the CIO to be able to ask a question about this, we've made a real mess of this. We've eroded trust, and some of those healthcare systems are getting fined $15 million for these data breaches. How can we actually think about a healthcare system that has a large number of data security researchers on staff, privacy experts on staff? Long answer, longer. I'm doing that a lot today. I apologize. I think we need to think about, what does a clinician actually have to know? And when do we need to think about giving them the right resources in terms of new colleagues in their daily environment that support them to make good choices and good decisions and operate in an environment where healthcare is being delivered in a digital environment?
Yeah, I love that. It makes me think of the quote by my former mentor and professor Paul Batalden up at Dartmouth when he said, every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets, right? And I think we do have a real opportunity in thinking about educating the decision makers of the future, right, and the present. And I think you guys have done a lot of great work. Maybe, because you had to, starting in the present, and there's a real opportunity, I think, for a lot of us to grab onto this movement, also as educators, and make sure that that the clinicians and other team members of the healthcare system of the future are trained in digitally enabled healthcare, right? Again, I often make the comment of what would we do if we could start again from scratch with the science and technology that we have today and build a new system of care, right? And obviously, it's clear it would look a lot different, but teaching and training in that world is a real opportunity.
I agree completely. And what I think is interesting is we don't need to completely blow up everything that we've been doing. At its heart, good clinical decision making is, do the benefits outweigh the risks? I think what we just need to sort of embrace is that there are new benefits and there are certainly new risks, and we just need to understand what they are. We've done some work, and I regret not including it now actually, but specifically related to things like cyber harm, for example. And we actually use a lot of the we've referenced as a starting point a lot of the rubrics that have been used to talk about drug safety, right? Toxicity, like there are different kinds of harm, and how can we create an analogous rubric for the risk of cyber harm, right? No one expects to go in, for example, for a knee replacement and actually end up with a credit score of 0 because a healthcare system got breached and they got their credit card and this, that, and the other. That's a new kind of harm in a connected era, right? It's not the most egregious one. Usually you can patch that up, but we've never thought about that as a side effect from a knee replacement before, but yet we've seen those data being breached and we've seen those harms being executed. So there's just all of these new different ways that we need to think through these challenges. And I go back to this idea, we need other experts to support our clinicians in this era.
Yeah, love that. Hard to believe how much you've accomplished in 4 years. For diversifying digital clinical trials, are you looking to expand the information DIME offers to partnering with either clinicians or companies to more actively help them design and persist with those trials?
Yes. I'm a horrible multitasker. I'm like absolutely incompetent. Otherwise maybe I'll try and do it. Drop a link. So we actually launched, and we were very proud. Dr. Rob Taylor from FDA joined us to give opening remarks. So we came out with a big workbook and resources around advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion in digitized clinical trials. And what I'm just going to say it, what pisses me off sometimes about this is the question that we get asked, especially on the research side of the house, although I think the same applies to healthcare delivery, is, well, how do you know that these tools aren't going to make, these trials more, inequitable? I'm like, do you know how bad it is right now? It's exactly the wrong question. And I think that what we need to think about is that we find ourselves in a watershed moment, whether we're on the clinical trial side of the house or whether on the healthcare delivery. We are fundamentally changing the mechanisms, the processes, the incentive structures. Why don't we just insist that we develop and deploy these solutions in such a way that for the first time in the history of healthcare in this country, we actually bring everyone with us? Instead of agonizing over whether if we put this watch into something, what if you don't have Wi-Fi? Again, solvable problem. It's called 2G. It really doesn't matter. These are just the things that we need to communicate. And I think we need to start asking the right questions. And I've nearly got to where I wanted to be around those resources, which is we will continue to build out the sorts of toolkits that I'm about to drop into the chat here. If I can find the toolbar. Yep, there we go. Let me see if I can drop this to everyone. Oh, I can't. I'm going to drop that, and then maybe Jen, you can drop it to the broader group if you wouldn't mind. But we will continue not just to, I think, try and insist on what good looks like, but also to create action-oriented open access resources that are available to everyone. And one of the things I think we've done best at Dime is to actually do the storytelling around the value that's returned to people who have used these tools previously. So if you actually look at the link that I just dropped in our work there, we have already over 50 examples of how people have used these tools and resources in order to improve the diversity, equity, and/or inclusion of their trials when they've taken a digital solution and incorporated it. So it's not a question of, oh gosh, will it make it worse? It's more like, I'm doing something differently. How can I make sure this serves everyone? And it's such a good mindset adjustment. And I'm really proud of the proof points we already have.
Yeah. We will be cheering you on with the massive amount of work that's at your opportunity. Another question here about remote therapeutic monitoring. I've been working with a lot of innovators who are planning to use the new remote therapeutic monitoring reimbursement. If you had to look into your crystal ball, do you see this pathway changing drastically in the next few years?
I do, actually. One, we're working on it, and I'd always back us because I'm obnoxious like that. And two, I think it has to, right? And I think this goes back to what I was hinting at previously, which is I think that we've approached payment and reimbursement for digital tools and telehealth and all of these sorts of things as being a sort of virtual version of what we've been doing in the hospital. And I think what we have, or in the clinic, and I think what we have to realize is the whole point of doing this is it should be fundamentally different. So, let's say you are doing remote blood pressure monitoring, for example. So instead of saying, this is where I'm sure there's a ton of cardiologists on the line and I'm about to embarrass myself, but, instead of saying, I'm going to put you on this medication and you're going to come back in 3 months regardless, what we're going to say is, here's a medication and we're going to monitor you. And the goal of that is actually that they don't come back and that you actually get their blood pressure under control. And if you start to see it drifting, that it's actually not that they come in and use one of the expert cardiologists like yourself, like this limited capacity is refined for those more complex patients. And frankly, those patients who are going to bring you revenue. And what we can do is have maybe a pharmacist or a nurse or someone reach out if we start to see a trend and a drift. And it might be a dietary intervention. It might be that someone's insurance has changed and they can't access their medication anymore. It might be that a spouse has died and that's always cooked for them and now they're depressed and they have all of these other issues. That doesn't require a cardiologist, and we want to keep them out of the clinic. So if that's how we're going to use remote patient monitoring, we have to contemplate the fact that you're actually losing the visit revenue, and that has to be included in the remote patient monitoring. These are the different ways we need to approach this. And I think that another way that we think about this is, and maybe controversially for some folks on the line, but there's a facility fee that goes with a visit that's executed in the clinic. Well, why is that waived in a virtual environment where actually we have to be maintaining things like security and privacy, and we should be doing R&D on the platform and all of these sorts of things? Why is that any different to making sure the plumbing in the bathroom works? It's as fundamentally important to the virtual era. So I think that through good storytelling and advocacy and simple common sense, which, let's not over anchor to that, but we should be able to, in the next few years, do a better job of articulating what virtual care actually is, and thus, go through the pretty exhausting sort of RVU process in order to get better and more appropriate CPT codes.
Yeah, love that. And I think for many of you might have seen in the Boston Globe, even just, I think the last week or two, there was a good discussion around virtual care and exactly that fact, right? That like going into, oh yeah, okay, we're getting paid at 80% for some plans, and the challenges with that, right? And that there's still a lot of back end resources that need to come into play to make these virtual visits happen. And so it just doesn't make sense to not pay parity. So appreciate that. We are at time, and we just want to again thank Jennifer for most importantly helping to start DIME and seeing the gap in our digitized healthcare system, and for all the work her and her team has done, and all of her partners for that matter. And again, a shout out to them, and really to us as well, to really a call to action, I suppose, to join with them, look for these key opportunities to engage in this collaborative relationship as we digitize healthcare. And thank you all for attending.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Jen.
Yeah. Thank you,
All
everyone.
best.